As Hurricane Irma plows north, we'll look into the government's response and how it's performing with key vacancies at the National Hurricane Center and NOAA. We have insight and warnings tonight from former Republican Congressman David Jolly.
This is a government who is woefully understaffed.
And former Democratic Congressman Patrick Murphy.
Well, quite frankly, it's an embarrassment to our country, if you ask me.
Plus, with FEMA on fumes and Congress focused on relief for Hurricane Harvey, we'll look at what happens if FEMA runs out of money after Hurricane Irma. This is a special edition of Money, Power, and Politics.
And of course, our weather team and our news team continues to track Hurricane Irma and will continue to keep us posted and updated. Also, in a couple of minutes, we'll take a closer look at what Irma could do to the insurance market here in Florida and to our premiums and what insurance does and does not cover, and how many more people could get burned by dropping flood insurance before this storm hit. We're going to start with the lessons that we learned some 25 years ago after Category 5 Hurricane Andrew slammed South Florida.
Everything ran out. All the batteries were gone.
So 25 years ago, families in South Florida prepared for a storm, as they often do this time of year.
We're getting ready to board up. I ain't gonna wait for the last minute.
Yes, sir. Better safe than sorry.
But then they discovered this one was different.
A strong Category 4, probably sustained winds of 140 miles an hour.
And people started to panic.
The fiberglass resin, they destroyed every single thing that was on the shelf. They destroyed it. They went mad. They're crazy.
And they still had no idea what was coming. None of us did until the surge and blinding winds passed.
Total devastation. It's unbelievable.
The people who came home to these blown out windows were lucky by comparison to the entire blocks of homes that got smashed to pieces.
Never in my wildest dreams did I ever think this would happen.
Hurricane Andrew killed at least 65 people, and it wiped out communities in the Miami area from Homestead to Kendall to Florida City. And homes washed together into mounds of splinters as far as the eye can see. But notice how you'll still see a stray house or two still standing. That's when it dawned on state leaders that some homes were built to higher standards than others, and that we needed to beef up the building code across the board.
See, the particle board will just basically crumble.
Turns out a lot of the houses were mostly built out of particle board.
Your roof, the entire house is particle board. When it gets wet, it just completely falls apart.
And a lot of the roofs weren't even nailed into the homes, and that's just the start.
With the proper strapping, this home very well could have held together.
And so after Andrew, state leaders required tougher inspections, and they created a statewide code to require new construction to withstand hurricane-force winds, among other changes. Building inspectors said Florida learned its lesson from Andrew by developing the strongest building rules in the nation.
They're minimal now, mind you. The codes are minimal. So you want to ensure that it at least meets the minimal standards for life safety.
And that's where consumer watchdogs say state lawmakers just made a big mistake, because on this 25th anniversary of Hurricane Andrew, they say the legislature and Governor Scott are weakening the state building code.
We're concerned that we're changing something that worked really well.
Mike Romaldi is the former Hillsborough County building official who now works for the nonprofit consumer group Federal Alliance for Safe Homes.
You could have homes that weren't built as strong as they could have been. The worst case scenario could be we could be back where we were around the time of Hurricane Andrew, where different jurisdictions are upholding different standards.
In short, the feds keep revising the national building rules to keep up with research and technology and changes in the construction industry. And the state has been automatically working those updates into its building code. But state lawmakers just made those updates optional. From now on, they'll pick and choose what they adopt from the feds.
Where it's not a one-size-fits-all country. The soils and the geology and the construction and wind loads and things like that are much different in Florida than they are in Nebraska.
But if you're not making the updates, are you then by definition not falling behind the national standards?
I don't believe so.
The idea is to make the code more relevant to Florida and to simplify the code process that can be hard to keep track of. And state lawmakers say, what's wrong with that?
There is no evidence that by allowing this flexibility in the new bill that we pass will weaken the code.
But consumer groups like Flash say the more we test, the more we learn.
We're losing anything that might be new science or technology along the way could in turn weaken the code.
And with that, they fear Florida may be forgetting the lessons we learned 25 years ago.
And critics of the building code changes also fear this will reduce or potentially remove discounts that we get on flood insurance. State lawmakers say that they wrote safeguards into the legislation to make sure that does not happen. And Governor Scott defended the changes that he signed into law. Here's part of the statement we received from the governor's office. Quote, this bill, which overwhelmingly passed the legislature, reduces burdensome regulations while maintaining Florida's gold standard of safety and innovation through an efficient and effective building code adoption process. Meanwhile, as Hurricane Irma tracked toward Florida this week, the top position at the National Hurricane Center is still vacant and has been for months. The former director took a job at the Weather Channel. Meanwhile, the National Hurricane Center reports to NOAA, and the top position at NOAA is still vacant and has been for months because the administration has not yet picked an administrator. And on top of that, this week FEMA revealed it's nearly broke. That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The agency responsible for natural disaster relief said it spent what money it had less than 2 weeks after Hurricane Harvey. House Speaker Paul Ryan explained how he got that bad news.
Many of us got the calls from the administration and OMB who said FEMA is moving so fast that we're running out of money as early as Friday to Tuesday. So we've got to make sure that we have the authority, legal authority, to go out and be able to put money back into FEMA so we can respond to these hurricanes. Not to mention the fact that we already have to start pre-positioning for the fact that Irma is about to hit Florida.
And so President Trump blindsided fellow Republicans and struck a deal with Democrats to pump nearly $8 billion into FEMA and raise the debt ceiling and keep the rest of the federal government running for at least 3 more months. But it's not clear how much longer that extra money for FEMA will last, especially with what's happening right now with Hurricane Irma.
Congress knows this is an emergency. We are acting decisively. There are no Democrats. There are no Republicans. There are no party divisions. We are all Americans here today to make sure that the people who suffered the most get the help the quickest.
Okay, please welcome my next guest, former Congressman Patrick Murphy, Democrat from South Florida, David Jolly, Republican from Pinellas County. Let's start with FEMA. How in the world can FEMA run out of money just days into dealing with Hurricane Harvey?
The lack of progress in Congress is being shown pretty clearly to Americans right now that we are on the brink of running out of money in such an important agency.
Look, it's lack of foresight, but also lack of hard decision making and good decision making. Patrick and I both represented coastal communities. A number of members, Republican, Democrat, who have understood for a long time the need to fund FEMA. In fact, we fought against a lot of conservatives in Congress who tried to cut mitigation accounts. You know, the very accounts that are being used to respond to Harvey now, even this president and this Congress tried to cut just months ago, and we see how short-sighted that is. At the end of the day, they will have the money, but only because we will see this mix of both compassion and hypocrisy in Washington, D.C. in responding to Harvey, to Irma, and other disasters.
Have the money. We're talking about an initial infusion of $8 billion. You've got estimates from Harvey at $160 billion. How do you know that FEMA doesn't burn through that in a matter of weeks before you have the full scope of damage from anything Irma may do?
There is no doubt they will be coming back to the Congress for more money. And hate to say it, thinking about what Hurricane Irma could do to the east coast of Florida, but you're talking major money. And as two members of Congress that represent coastal districts will both tell you that there's a certain amount of resources that are wise to spend on the front end on mitigation that would actually save money on the back end for things like this. And we actually started a caucus to try to address this. We are, I would say, two fiscally responsible leaders in our communities that want to spend money wisely. And there are some things we should be doing, especially in states like Florida, to harden our communities for events like this.
in times of natural disaster, it is the explicit function of the government to come in and provide for recovery efforts. It is short-sighted that Congress has failed to do that in the past. My hope is that we will see them do it in response to these hurricanes now.
So you have Hurricane Harvey already struck. You've got Irma lumbering north, and you do not have a full-time director at the National Hurricane Center. You do not have full-time leadership at NOAA. What's the problem, and what can we do about it, and when?
It does leave us served by a remarkable force of career government employees who actually are the subject matter experts in how to respond. We have seen that with the current FEMA director. We are seeing that with other people who have spent their careers in government responding to this. At the end of the day, this is a government who is woefully understaffed, including these critical positions. We know that's the case.
Well, quite frankly, it's an embarrassment to our country, if you ask me. You know, the world looks to us for leadership. They look to us for guidance. They look to us oftentimes to learn of how our government might work and how we are prepared and recover from disasters like this. But based on what we're seeing now and you know, not having agency directors, talk about an embarrassment that we should all be ashamed of, not having these people in position. And it's not like this is 1 month into this presidency. You know, this is, you know, what, 8 months now into this.
It is a fair criticism of this administration to recognize the failure to appoint leaders and the failure to properly fund the functions of government. It is our hope always that government responds well, and that this president and the Congress do, and our local emergency responders do. We are hopeful that their response will mitigate loss of life and loss of property. It is also fair, though, to recognize the response could be so much better with leadership and sufficient funding.
Now, both of you are on tour together, touring the state with town halls focused on how to break the gridlock in Washington and what's causing it. We will bring both of you back next week to talk more specifically about how to bring some sense of civility back to Washington and get things done. Gentlemen, thank you both.
Great to be with you.
Coming up, we saw how people in Houston needed flood insurance but did not have it. Now see how and why so many people in Florida are unprotected, including hazard zones in South Florida and all along the Florida coast. Before the storms, we discovered a lot of people who live along the coasts of Texas and Florida dropped their flood insurance. We're talking about people who live in hazard zones, and many of them live in southeast Florida. So here's a look at what happened.
5 years ago, Congress raised the price of flood insurance, and our government also redrew some of the high-risk zones in such a way that flood insurance was no longer required in places where it had been required for decades. So when it became optional in many places, and when the price shot up, a lot of people who live along the coast decided they didn't need it, especially after years of calm. But guess what happened next? That's what happened in Houston. Flood swept in and homeowners got burned because their homeowners insurance did not cover flood damage. That's what flood insurance is for. And a lot of people who need it, therefore, no longer have it. Estimates show the flooding from Hurricane Harvey caused more than $65 billion in damage that will not be covered by insurance. And according to the National Flood Insurance Program, only half of the 10 million homes that need flood coverage actually have it. And now many of those homes are clustered in the path of Hurricane Irma.
And we're here now with Nicole Vinson, an insurance attorney with Merlin Law Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you have flood coverage down 15% past 5 years across the nation. If you look at the coastal counties of Florida, right now only 42% have flood coverage, drops down to around 30-something% in southeast Florida. How can that even be when our lenders require us to have it in high-risk areas as a condition of getting a mortgage?
This is something that is of travesty, and the policyholders of Florida should have flood insurance when it's mandatory and even when it's voluntary because of such storms that we've been having. How does it happen, though? It's slipping through the cracks. The mortgage companies are going to send a letter to you if they don't catch that you have insurance, either windstorm coverage, hurricane insurance, or flood insurance if you have a mortgage. But to have them babysit and mandate that, that's where I think some people are saying, you know what, we missed it. We missed that we didn't have it, or we gave it up because it was too expensive, and the mortgage companies aren't always enforcing it, or they've missed it too.
In St. Pete, for example, flood coverage is down 10% in 5 years. to folks who say, uh-oh, maybe not the best move. I need to buy this. They can't buy it now. When can they, and when would it kick in?
That's correct. Flood insurance needed to be purchased before a state of emergency was declared, and until that state of emergency is lifted, there's the inability for anyone to purchase flood insurance in those counties in Florida, which is now all 67. So when they can purchase it, then it will go, they need to go to their agent and get that locked in for their property.
You also have citizen shedding policies, which is a good thing. We want this. Private insurers jumping into the state-run pool. But what if you've been moved from Citizens to some company you've never heard of? You think back to the collapses of other insurance companies. Poe comes to mind. Can people be fully confident that their company will remain solvent regardless of whatever Irma may deliver?
That's a fair question, and I always tell my clients that there's a consideration to be made with a private insurance company because it's not Citizens and the last resort insurance company. But the question becomes, is that new company going to be able to financially, just like the Poe companies, be able to stay in the game after these insurance claims are put in? Can they afford it? If they can't afford it, FIGA takes over, and the laws with FIGA have changed, and the ability to get paid has changed. So the new companies, they need to be financially stable. Many of them should be, but some, I think, have put forth information that they can survive the storm when really their records are showing very much concern about whether they can pay out the claims for all the risks that they've taken on because they're in risky areas.
You look at what happened 25 years ago with Andrew. To what extent can another major hurricane striking Florida have on the insurance market? One, in tagging all of us, per se, with a surcharge of some type, costing us more, and two, driving more insurers out of the state.
That's correct. With the magnitude of Irma, there will be many claims, but the insurance companies have the wherewithal to pay these claims properly. My fear is that's not going to happen, and there are going to be surcharges, and there's going to be denied claims that should be properly paid.
What happens if your home is gone and you bring out the flood insurance adjuster and he says, this is terrible, your home's been blown away? Go see your hurricane insurance adjuster. Hurricane insurance adjuster says, this is terrible, your whole home has been flooded away. Go see your flood insurance adjuster, and they do this. What next?
Hopefully we won't see that with this insurance, with this hurricane, because there should be better coverages in place, but the insurance policy is going to dictate the coverage. The concern is that when there is a policy that's missing one of those, property that's missing one of those policies, that can be an issue, but policyholders shouldn't give up. If they're being told that there is not going to be coverage, we need to analyze and look at those insurance policies to make sure that they are being properly abided by, because it's very easy for one insurance company to say it's the other carrier's responsibility when that may be contrary to what the agreement states. And what you really want to consider is the damage to the property.
Nicole Vinson, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, what could happen if Tampa Bay took a direct hit from a major hurricane? Well, before Hurricane Irma, we saw how Hurricane Harvey swamped Texas. So we want to show you once again what could happen if Tampa Bay took a hit like Houston.
Our garage is flooded. Our whole first floor is flooded. It's like, that's crazy.
Hurricane Harvey swamped entire neighborhoods around Houston and drove rooftop evacuations that may remind you of Hurricane Katrina.
We are seeing catastrophic flooding.
It turned the streets into boat channels and left thousands of families to sleep in gas stations or trudge through waist-high water to get to a shelter.
They're completely soaked. I mean, I don't even know what to say.
So you see why the FEMA director said we haven't seen anything quite like this.
But you couldn't draw this situation up.
And believe it or not, it could have been as bad, if not worse, if a hurricane like Harvey struck Tampa Bay.
You wouldn't even see the roof.
A USF study once showed that if a major hurricane hit North Pinellas County, MacDill Air Force Base would get swamped in 13 feet of water. Thousands of homes in Tampa would see the same kind of flooding we've seen in Houston, and we've known this for years.
Where my cursor is going around is the USF campus.
10 years ago, the Pinellas property appraiser developed simulations for Pinellas. This is St. Petersburg after a Category 1 hurricane. The model shows that it also puts much of Dunedin underwater. Reddington Shores gets it from both sides. And when you bump it up to a Category 2 hurricane, most of Reddington Shores gets flooded. Dunedin gets swamped, and flooding sweeps to Bayfront Tower in St. Petersburg. Move up to a Category 3 storm, and it takes out 4th Street in St. Petersburg. And those white squares or specks are all we can see of the Old Southeast. The model also shows a Category 4 storm would flood the interstate in Tropicana Field. A Category 5 turns the whole downtown blue, and much of the interstate and other major streets go underwater, just as we've seen this week in Texas.
Now this week we're focused on Irma, but long before Hurricane Irma, Congress ordered extra Hurricane Hunter aircraft, but they did not arrive. We'll ask why, what it means. You're looking at the Hurricane Hunter airplanes that play such a critical role. This from inside the plane looking out in helping us track and learn more about hurricanes like Irma. Senator Bill Nelson expressed concern just before Irma struck that Congress ordered a backup set of planes that NOAA did not secure, something we'll be looking into in the weeks ahead. But in the days ahead, of course, our focus is on the fallout and the damage in the people affected by Hurricane Irma. Stay with us here on Fox 13 News and online to receive the very latest. Have a good night.